Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Before we get to the interview, let me introduce our special guest. Martin Hughes is a graduate of Long Island University with a Master's of Science in Cybersecurity. He is certified in cybersecurity risk management with experience ranging from data analysis to software engineering and is currently a professor at Kaiser University. He is a passionate educator who is dedicated to inspiring and developing students into competent professionals ready to excel in the tech industry. First question, what makes you so interested or passionate about talking about high cognitive functioning individuals?
As the result of getting a cognitive assessment battery done, I just started doing some research about the results, and that's how I got interested in high cognitive functioning individual.
Nice. What have you
IQ tests, etc.
With your research? What have you found that really interests you or made you want to continue focusing?
Well, in my view, and from the research that I've read, there seems to be a high correlation between what an IQ test scores, basically the cognitive assessment battery, and people's tendency to achieve a certain level, whether that be academically or professionally. And there'll be some who don't believe, of course, in IQ tests. They'll believe that they're biased or skewed toward something. But what's interesting is, from what I understand from the research, is that in the world of psychometrics, biases are not necessarily a concern. Biases are more the area of social commentary. And not for nothing, but I tend to see that the people who don't believe in the validity of IQ tests, to be blunt, tend not to score as well as those who do believe in IQ tests.
Now, does that, and I'm glad you brought that up because I do want to talk a little bit about the validity of IQ tests. So you're right to mention a lot of people have questions regarding validity about IQ tests because they're like, you can't really measure intelligence with a pen and paper. You know, you present these questions, you give people some cognitive exercises and things to think through, and they either get the answer right or wrong. And they're like, you can't really measure intelligence in that way. What would you say to those people?
Well, what happens is, a cognitive assessment battery is not just answering questions or the stereotypical shape questions.
Mental rotation, things like that.
Part of the cognitive assessment involves dealing with what's known as working or short-term memory. And again, people of high cognitive function tend to have high working memory scores, meaning, for instance, one of the assessments is, I tell you, for instance, 10 words. 10 minutes goes by, we talk about something else, and then I ask you to repeat back to me those 10 questions. Or exercises or assessments in mental manipulation, meaning you repeat, ask me to repeat 7 numbers to you, 7 sets of numbers, or repeat them to you backwards or something. And again, assessments show that not only do people with high working memory scores, they tend to also have high full function IQ scores. And the reasoning, from what I understand from the research, is that people who have high IQs tend to have good working / short-term memory, meaning you tell them something and they're able to kind of mentally manipulate or work something in their mind where they can give you either a quick answer or they can kind of mentally massage a problem or something in their mind. And again, those with good working memory scores tend to also have high total IQ scores.
Yeah. So that leads to my next question of what we actually consider intelligence, right? Because a lot of people are like, well, sure, these tests might be able to measure what cognitive skill sets your brain is good at, but at the same time, some people say, well, a lot of these tests are very specific at measuring certain IQ skills. Or they might say, if you take a general IQ test, if someone scores low on a general IQ test, they might be average or even below average on a general IQ test. But if they take an IQ test that is more concentrated and specific to a skill that they're really good at, and they score really high, would that be considered high intelligence, even though they scored low on general intelligence? Or is intelligence just a general thing? Like, you can be concentrated in very specific areas and score really high, but at the same time, maybe what we would call true intelligence are people who are just generally intelligent. They're not specifically skilled in one or two things. Their brain is just good at a lot of things. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, some people, I mean, there are, by some accounts, intelligences, like, for instance, emotional intelligence, things of that nature, like domain specific.
Right.
And people with high cognitive functioning scores tend to have high ability in one area, but deficits in other areas. For instance, someone might be good in math, but they may not be so good at verbal score, or they may be visually minded, or they learn best verbally. The other thing is that there is, of course, and this perhaps is one of your next questions, is there's also a component that some say that plays a role in it, and that's also the nurture argument. That people, for instance, Asians, of course, the debate is that, are they naturally smarter than other people? I think it's a combination of total cognitive ability, and in the Asian culture, you don't study, you're going to hear from it from your parents. So there's a pressure. It's almost like a kind of mental status symbol to go to a specific school or to score specifically in a certain percentile. But in terms of overall cognitive ability versus someone who, let's say, tends to score well in one particular subject, I would suspect they might have a particular affinity toward a certain subject area. But also the people with, backing up a little bit, historically, there was well, I guess he turned out to be a psychometrist, Lewis Terman, who basically made up one of the early IQ scores, IQ tests, and he came up with a generalized intelligence factor called G. And people with high G scores, or general intelligence scores, tended to score well no matter the specific domain. And he, of course, would say because the generally high cognitive person, if they don't necessarily have a high ability toward, let's say, rocket science, for example, their ability to work through issues and problems will sometimes make up for that deficit, because, again, the person with a high cognitive ability tends to have that ability where it's not necessarily raw intelligence, but it's the ability to basically problem solve.
To analyze and draw conclusions logically, rationally, and that is a form of intelligence that is applied to all areas of academia. So when people talk about education and what we do as teachers, a part of education, a big part of it, is teaching students how to become critical thinkers. And it doesn't matter what subject you're studying, history, science, physics, mathematics, English, doesn't matter. All subjects in the world of education, we want to teach critical thinking. And it's just in that particular field or subject, you get the knowledge, the background in that field, but you're still applying critical thinking. So I do think there is something to the G factor to say, even if you're not knowledgeable or necessarily skilled in certain areas of academics, like a lot of calculation and math, you might not be the best mentally calculated individual, but if you have the basic foundational abilities to logically think through problems and think critically, and you have the basic mathematical skills that can help you solve an equation or get to an answer. Requiring it's general. It's not something very specific and challenging like calculus, something that maybe a math major would be more skilled at. I do think there is. Oh, don't worry about the lights. So they always turn on, but there's enough lighting. You'll see us. But I do think there is something to say about the G factor of general intelligence and what people are capable of and what they can do. So I do have some trust in the validity of intelligence. So I always found that to be very interesting.
Yeah, so some people will dismiss IQ tests, such as the Ways for Wechsler assessment battery. I think Pearson publishes it.
Yeah.
But the people who tend to dismiss IQ tests or attribute some cultural bias, for example, the assessment battery, at least that I took, and the assessment batteries that I've seen, like the Ways for or the Stanford Binet, like for instance, the SAT might have, like for instance, in what sporting arena would you see a, I think it's like for instance, the SAT people who say something is biased might say, well, a regatta, someone from, let's say, a lower income class may not know sailing terms compared to someone from upper middle or upper income class. But the test questions that tend to be on, for instance, the Ways for Stanford Binet don't have items such as that. They have items, for instance, that would be, for example, the stereotypical, mathematical pattern thing, because those are looking for one's ability to see patterns, not necessarily like content questions. I know there's the Cattell cultural fairness test that tends to strip out some alleged cultural bias. But I mean, I think, for example, now even though George Washington was a U.S. president, I would submit that people in most areas of the world have some knowledge of some of the U.S. presidents.
Right.
Like it's one of those things that go beyond some alleged cultural bias. Like for instance, I'm not Muslim, but I know about prayer rugs, Ramadan, things like that nature. So I could easily answer those type of questions. So I wouldn't consider those type of things, culturally biased. I would just classify them as just, general knowledge you're taught in some generic world history class.
Yeah. And I remember, kind of to backpedal a little bit, you talked a lot about nurture and you brought up like socioeconomic class and everything. Do you think socioeconomic class, there's a correlation, but you brought up nurture as well, and it kind of leads me to think that maybe nurturing has more of an influence on intelligence, because you see, or it could be a bias, I'm not sure, but you see people from higher socioeconomic families, people who have more educated parents, people who have come from wealthier families, people who are in higher level professions, their kids tend to score higher on IQ tests. Their kids tend to, and that's not genetics, because a lot of people over time develop their wealth and then they have kids, and then the kids grow up hopefully with a better, more stable socioeconomic lifestyle. And we see this correlation of kids who come from more financially stable households and even two-parent households, they tend to have higher levels of IQ. And to me, that points to maybe nurturing could be a bigger part in terms of our intelligence. I do know that a lot of psychological studies show that normally the oldest sibling has the highest level of intelligence, or the highest IQ, than younger siblings, because the firstborn child got the full attention of mom and dad. And then the next child and the child below them, they kind of got the divided attention between all the other students. So there's something to the attention that the parents give the kids in speaking to the kid that really fundamentally sets their brain up for intelligence. And I think a lot of it has to do with conditioning and nurturing the brain to process information.
Yeah, I think
efficiently, because I think people who can process information efficiently, that I think is the root of intelligence.
Right. Yeah. What I see is that nature or nurture plays some role in an IQ score, so to speak. I tend to think of it as that money in and of itself, I would argue, does not play a role in IQ. I would say that access to resources Now, some would argue, of course, you can't access the same resources if you have $10 versus $1,000.
Right.
But the access to resources can play a role in cognitive development. But I would argue, aside from that, independent of that, I would argue the greatest factor in, other than natural IQ ability, I would argue the single most important factor is priority. For instance, it's not necessarily that you're, first or second generation person off the boat, so to speak, has more access to resources and money, but certain people tend to have a higher priority in, let's say, education versus, let's say, a inner city person who has to worry about whether they're going to be shot going to school, a person who has to worry about what food they're going to put on the table.
They're worried about other things besides academics.
Exactly. Their priority is not necessarily academics. Although, there are plenty of examples of, inner city people who have, succeeded in life. But I think it's a priority, and I'll give you an example of priority that's not necessarily directly related. But for instance, certain people on social welfare programs, they tend to be a target of criticism. And I've noticed that some people, everyone can fall upon hard times from time to time, and they may need public assistance, which in and of itself is not wrong. But I tend to see from my own experience that people who tend to make a lifestyle out of it rather than an aid. For instance, it's no wonder that the stereotypical person, let's say, on social assistance, has a better TV than I do, has a better game console than I do, and that's because the people who tend to have less than other people, their priority tends to be different. Meaning, for instance, they're not thinking about school. They may spend their time, let's say, playing video games rather than concentrating on academic success. Their parents work, so they're not able to help tutor or guide or help their children study. So then their academic performance may not be as high as, for instance, let's say the family who's, and it just doesn't have to be, let's say, like the wife who stays home with her kid and helps them study in school.
Right.
It's just a priority in terms of, let's say both parents work, but they stay on top of their kids to study, to do their assignments and things like that. So I tend to think that it's priority is the biggest factor.
Yeah, so would you kind of say priority is linked into people's culture? Culture is kind of what people emphasize as values and important in life. So you were mentioning how in Asian cultures, it is true that in a lot of Asian cultures, they do emphasize and invest a little bit more time into education. Here in the United States, sports is a big part of our, educational programs, right?
I think a lot of times people who, right or wrong, it's kind of neutral, people who tend not to succeed academically as well, in the US, sports affords them a way out. Meaning, for instance, the person who is like one of those diamond in the rough, so to speak, who is, like the next Patrick Mahomes in high school, they have a way out. They have a way of success. And by the way, Patrick Mahomes' Wonderlic score, was not that high. But see, and like whether it's baseball or soccer, sports offers, for instance, high school students a way to pay for college, or let's say they're an outstanding athlete in college, it affords them a way out in terms of they have a career, a team is going to sign them afterwards. I mean, that's rare because obviously not everyone graduating college can be a Patrick Mahomes.
Right.
But additionally, I think you look at the, and I was an athletic director of a small school, and I personally saw firsthand that one of the best ways to, shall we say, turn students around, so to speak, whether it be behaviorally or academically, is to put them on a sports team. Because I found, being an athletic director, that students don't want to disappoint their coach, particularly football.
Right.
No player wants to warm the bench. And in most cities or school districts, if you fall below a certain academic level, you can't play.
Right.
So that's a tremendous motivator
To keep
priority,
them focused on their academics too.
which goes back to people who tend to succeed not only have either some natural ability to succeed, but they also have the motivating factor to succeed.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that makes me curious to know your thoughts on people's general interests to learn and be interested in things that are more academically related. For example, here in the United States, a lot of people don't read because they find reading boring. Right?
Yeah.
They rather watch a video on it or hear someone talk about it. But to read, open up a book and read it, the people can find it very boring. Right? But then there are some people who like reading because they like their mind wandering. People who read sci-fi, or people who read comic books or academic things that really tickle their brain and makes them kind of run off with all these crazy ideas and thoughts. Some people have a general, I don't want to say a natural interest in that, but people have different interests in different things. And I can't help but be curious to wonder if maybe intelligence starts with people's, I don't want to say innate or intuitive, because I think it can be nurtured too, but this general interest of just creatively and imaginatively, abstractly thinking, thinking abstractly.
It's interesting you mention that, because a characteristic of high cognitive individuals is, a common characteristic is that they tend to read. And reading, I think, like for instance, I love to read. I have several hundred books in my Kindle, and anything like under 300 pages I tend not to read because it's too much of a tease to me. I like 500 to 1,000 page books.
Oh wow.
I like reading dissertations, Supreme Court opinions, but I think reading, one of the reasons why reading tends to be a characteristic of people of a high cognitive ability is they love to learn. Reading allows that. It expands the mind, because I'll admit I love a good brain rotting movie.
Yeah.
But it's just passive. Whereas reading not that entertainment can't engage, but reading particularly tends to engage the mind, because if you're reading fiction, for example, you're trying to,
imagine the story.
Imagine the story, or you're trying to imagine yourself as J.K. Rowling writing her books, or Harry Potter. But for instance, if you're reading nonfiction, I tend to view this as a domain more to nonfiction, is it engages the mind because you're critically thinking over a particular issue, a particular problem, and you're trying to evaluate, particularly in the realm of nonfiction. I love reading, and I would rather, instead of going to some concert or even watching a movie, I'd rather sit at home, read something about cognitive neuroscience or some medical journal.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was leading to, because I'm like, because people are interested in different things, right? Some people, for example, I like to fish a lot too. There are some people who never fish their whole lives. They don't care about fishing. They don't care anything about fish, the activity, whatever. They have no interest in fishing, right? There are some people who are really interested in music and art, and then there are other people who they probably listen to music, but they're not really musically inclined, and music is not something they really involve their life with, in art and painting. And there are some people who may not be interested in science at all, or technology at all. Well, I think most people are interested in technology, but more for fun and entertainment, things like that. But the point I'm trying to make is people are interested in so many different things. I can't help but wonder if one of the major characteristics of predicting intelligence is seeing if people are just interested in doing activities that are specifically focused on just working the brain. So like when you're watching an entertaining movie or something, even if it's a fun sci-fi movie, people might not, like you said, people might prefer to read the book because it's more engaging with the mind. It's my brain, it's my abstraction, it's my story as I read, it's my creation as I'm reading the story, rather than a movie that's doing everything for me and I'm seeing someone else's creativity. I'm seeing someone else's product, right? And it's engaging, but it's not the same type of engagement. I can't help but think if that is a major characteristic of identifying and predicting intelligence.
Well, even as much as I like some brain rotting movie, even watching a movie, a TV show, my mind is still active. You know, like I'll admit, you know, like if I'm watching, you know, the stereotypical scenario where like Trekkies are looking to see if, you know, there's some scientific irregularity in the movie, in the TV show and stuff. Surprisingly, a lot of it is accurate. But for instance, if I'm watching like House MD, I love the show House. I could watch the series over and over and over again. But there, even though I'm being entertained, I'm still trying to diagnose along with, you know, the characters. Or, you know, if I'm watching, you know, a Marvel movie or a Star Wars movie, I'm being entertained, but I've always actively tried to figure out, you know, like what would this character do instead of what's being described. Or for instance, if I'm watching sitcom, I'll be like looking at it and seeing like, what are they really trying to tell me, or something like that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because it shows that you're focused on almost expanding your mind and the thoughts of what's stimulating your brain.
Right.
Yeah, go
I was going to say too, is high cognitive ability people I've seen be accused of kind of being, ironically, ADHD or ADD, because like to the uninitiated, it may look like someone is jumping from something to something, but for instance, with high cognitive ability people, it's not necessarily that their mind is ditzy or, you know, they can't concentrate. On the contrary, it's that they absorb something or get into something so much that they're looking for the new stimulation. Like for instance, you know, take the typical neurodiverse individual who they may seem to have a concentration in one particular thing at the exclusion of something else. And in some ways that may seem to be, you know, ADD or ADHD in terms of concentrate, although they tend not to transition easily. But oftentimes that can be misdiagnosed because it's not that the person, again, jumps from something to something. It's just that, particularly like the profoundly gifted, they tend to absorb and process things in such a quick manner that they go on to the next thing to learn, And
that's probably why high-performing students get bored of the average classroom. Because they're like, okay, I just learned this, now we can move on. I'm ready to learn the next thing. While other students are still slow to process, and the teacher might have to go through extra examples, might have to elaborate a little bit more on it, and the next student is just gone at this point.
Like for example, my current reading list in my Kindle, for someone who loves to dive into something and concentrate on a particular subject or journal, my current reading list is actually like 5 to 10 separate books, because I'll read, like I have a system, like I'll read maybe, let's say 50 pages in one, and then not that like it gets boring, but my mind needs new stimulation since it's delved so much into that, that I switch to a new book, and then I have a system where I, you know, kind of rotate through my current reading list.
Yeah, because I'm glad you mentioned that because I kind of do the same thing. But for me, like if I'm buying a book, I'll read, you know, the preface and the cover and the back of the book to get a general idea of it, and then I might read 1 or 2 chapters, and it's a good book, and then by the time I get to chapter 4, I'm like, this is just boring, you know. And it's not necessarily because, for me at least, I mean, my brain isn't probably as high functioning as yours, but for me, I'm just like, oh, this gets boring, so I skip it, and then I skip to like maybe the middle of the chapter 4 or something, and if it's still not exciting as like chapters 1, 2, and 3, then I skip the chapter and I'll go to chapter 5. And if it's not, you know, if it's not exciting or they're not talking about anything that I like, or anything that I can zone and get really lost in, then I just skip that chapter. And then there are a lot of books where I don't even read the whole book. Like I'll buy the book and I'll read, if it's like a 12, 13 chapter book, I might only read 6 or 7 chapters of it. And it's partly because of what you mentioned, but I don't think for me it's so much the case that I'm ready to learn the next thing. It's just a part of it is, you know, I get bored or I'm not interested because sometimes they're talking about something that really caught my attention, and then the next thing that they talk about, and I'm like, I don't, you know, I'm not interested, because a lot of books I read are not like novels or things like that. They're more philosophical works or monographs, biographies even. But for the most part, I'm glad you said that, because I'm like, am I the only one that does this? So I always found that to be interesting. But I do want to go back to, or bring up the new topic of school and IQ. How well do you think school and intelligence actually align?
I'll kind of combine the answer with, the critique of the SAT, where some will say that the SAT doesn't measure your presumed success in the next 4 years, but it just measures how well you do on the test. I mean, I guess to a certain extent, any test you take, there's a portion of that test that measures how much you're going to do well on that test. There's going to be some component of a test that, fits that. But I think, again...
but people can study for the SAT.
Right, they can study for the SAT, but they can't necessarily study for an IQ test.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there are those, fake IQ tests online that a lot of people like to make a hobby of taking. But a legitimate assessment, like the Ways 4 or Stanford Binet, I mean, I suppose you could probably find certain parts of it online or something, or if you visit 5 neuropsychologists, I suppose you can get used to the answers. But there are, again, certain components of, for instance, the Ways 4 that it would be hard to study for. Like, for instance, there's a speed processing component of it where, for instance, you have, let's say, this whole sheet of, you have to match patterns of something, and you just, as quickly as you can and accurately, just go through that. Or there's another part of it where you have to, though, let's say, for instance, they say, press the space bar when you see a white triangle, for example. It'll show you all sorts of shapes and colors, and when it does show you like a white triangle, for example, it measures the speed in which you react.
Time reaction.
And again,
time reaction tests, yeah.
There's been some correlation between people who have high working memory, high general IQ, that tend to react well. Again, and I think it all goes back to kind of a slice of that G factor, where people who have working memory or high working memory tend to be able to process things more quickly.
Yeah, so do you think maybe like valedictorians in schools, people who tend to be diversely great at a lot of academic subjects, like the valedictorian is a straight A student, they have the highest GPA out of any other student in the school, and they tend to excel in all areas of academia. Do you think maybe school and certain statuses and titles like valedictorian, having a 4.0 GPA, getting straight A's in all your classes, do you think that's a good measurement of intelligence then? Would you say?
I think I would have to combine it with, for instance, let's say knowledge of their home environment, meaning like the priority and stuff like that. But I do tend to think that people, what happened is in the early part of the century, like up to, let's say, the 50s or 60s, it seems that corporate jobs and slots in educational institutions tended to be more, shall we say, due to your family name. But something happened between the 60s and 80s where now the filtering mechanism into colleges tends to be IQ or things that reflect IQ, meaning, for instance, the SAT. Like, for instance, despite the critique of the SAT, that you can study for and whatnot, there is a correlation between, let's say, I think the 1600 is equivalent to someone with like a 140 or 160 IQ.
Wow.
Particularly the older. For instance, Mensa allows you to submit proof of the older SATs. I think before like 1980 or 1975, but not the more modern SATs. But I think like the valedictorian, I would submit kind of a combination of motivation, raw cognitive ability. I mean, there is I suspect a reason that, again, some would argue this is due to access to resources, but I don't necessarily think that those resources cause someone's IQ to go up. I think more that those resources refine and hone someone.
That makes sense.
And like for instance, one sort of exception that I see, but I see as the result of motivation and family is, for instance, and this is not a critique of the country, but in some people's view, like Singapore or the United States are more developed than, let's say, India. But India produces a lot of good software engineers.
A lot of medical doctors too from India.
Yeah. So I think it's a combination there of either innate cognitive ability or just the motivation to kind of make it, so to speak, and go to, let's say, the U.S. and become a doctor or something.
Right.
There's also, despite some people's views and critiques of IQ tests and of the bell curve in general, or the Gaussian distribution, is for some reason Ashkenazi Jews tend to have high IQs.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Still, do you think like Ivy League schools, for example, I know that Harvard, you have to score like at least a 1200 on the SAT for them to even consider your application seriously. Now they do a holistic approach where they just don't look at your SAT scores. They look at everything else, what you've been doing, maybe even a work resume, what leadership programs you were in, your overall GPA, academic history. They look at everything. But if you don't even meet that 1200 minimum, they won't even look at you. Do you think maybe big Ivy League institutions like Harvard, they draw a lot of intelligent students? But I can't help but wonder if it's because they know that correlation with the SAT to say, listen, if you want to come here, we look at your application holistically, but you do have to hit the minimum.
It's almost as if the reputation doesn't draw per se smart people, but the reputation causes the people to study. It causes them to be motivated and then kind of refine them, hone them, and then succeed. But what's interesting about Harvard, and I admit I have no love for Harvard University, but what's interesting is the latest Supreme Court opinion from Harvard in the famous Asian group brought a lawsuit before the United States Supreme Court. And then as a consequence, the Supreme Court made its opinion that racial preferences cannot be used in collegiate. But what happened was interesting is Harvard, and this was their death warrant basically. Harvard, what it does is the Asians were not being denied admission despite having I think a 20 or 30% population being Asian. But ironically, Harvard was not denying admission to Asians because they were smart. What happens is, and when you spoke about the holistic applicant, and this is what hung Harvard before the Supreme Court, is they were building profiles, racial profiles on groups of applicants. For instance, despite academic performance, despite, thought of higher intelligence, Harvard was denying Asians entrance because in their social profile, they perceived Asians as less socially active. So their social profile, their social score got a hit, which caused them to dip below a acceptable overall level. And I think that is what led to Harvard losing their case before the United States Supreme Court.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it came out that they were building profiles on Asians, or other groups as well. But in Asians, it's almost as if they weren't looking at their performance. Since colleges tend to like to advertise they're looking for, diverse contributions to the collegiate community, they thought that Asians would not be able to do that because Asians are generally perceived to be less active socially or less politically active. So that was basically one of the main reasons why Harvard lost their case.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I didn't follow up the
Yeah.
case. I just read this article about it, but it didn't go into that much detail. So
Ironically,
that's
though, I
interesting.
think the win before the U.S. Supreme Court is not necessarily a win for Asians. It's more of a win for whites.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why would you say that?
Because they can then say, because historically most entrants are Caucasians. Whether they believe that because they're just a larger portion of the population or because of some socioeconomic reason. But I tend to think of it as, for instance, in the original, I could be getting it wrong because I've read so many Supreme Court opinions, but in the original I think it was Baker versus Carr that said, you can't have certain preferences. Ironically, the actualization of it was the reverse, where they gave preference to, let's say, minorities over whites. Because ironically, in the
like
case,
affirmative action.
ironically in the case, it was a white person who was denied. Which also brings up a thing where, for instance, numerically, more whites are on welfare than other groups, just because I know that certain other groups like Hispanics or blacks tend to have that stigma, but in actuality, more whites are on welfare than other groups. Right. But because of that social perception, others may or may not be held back. Like for instance, even though technically Asians are minorities, we don't get treated as minorities. There's the whole thing about the model minority myth, but on the contrary, like mathematically, I don't fit that myth.
Same here.
Same here. And secondly, I think it does a great disservice to Asians or anyone who technically might be a minority, is because it says that you succeed because of your certain IQ score, but often that's not the case. It's because the parents have become more involved in the educational process versus, let's say, the stereotypical, low-income inner-city family. And then, of course, someone would argue, well, that's because either there's only one parent, or both parents work and they're not able to dedicate any time to their student,
or have the resources and means,
or have the resources. But the role of a parent, or that perhaps cultural priority of education, is one matter, and then there's another matter of debate where, for instance, do certain people, should they go to, or do they deserve to go to college,
right,
for example? And a lot of countries over in Europe, and for instance Asia, perfect example is in Asia, China, of course, the most famous for the Gaokao. In fact, the end of April, I think they just had their Gaokao. And that's, of course, their national exam, for instance, where there are, let's say, basically 3 tiers of colleges in China. First tier, of course, is Beijing University. That's like their Harvard,
right,
or their Carnegie Mellon.
So they have like divisions. Like here we have D1, D2, D3
so
in sports.
Based upon your score on the Gaokao, one test, no application, just one test, and that test literally determines your future in China. So if you get to score high enough to where you go to a tier 1 school, you stand better chance at socioeconomic success than someone who gets into, let's say, a 3rd tier school or 2nd tier school. I mean, there are even students in China, and similarly like in Korea and Singapore, who, if they don't score well enough, they'll study literally for another year to take that test. And they'll go to like specialized cram schools and stuff like that. Whereas you don't see that. Like, for instance, there's that filtering mechanism that once you attain the end of high school, you have to take that national exam to go on to college. Whereas here in the United States, there's not that mechanism. It's and I suspect some of it because of the business model of college. I strongly suspect that. But here in the US, it's almost presumed that you go on to college. But there's no like national test to determine to determine that. And
Yeah,
I think the U.S. would be well to, even here as we sit at an academic institution, I think there are students who, for various seasons of their life, maybe they have some other family priority or situation going on where maybe schooling is not for them, versus the traditional presumption that they go to school, they graduate, they can't pay back their loans because they found out that their degree or academic field is not for them, or they can't get employed. So in terms of productivity, I wonder if some of the students who are not made for college, but they have a good business mind, let's say, would we better serve those individuals by having some sort of system where they get a grant or a loan, let's say $200,000 to start their own business?
Yeah. No, that's interesting because the diversity of intellectual talent, as teachers, we kind of see that diversity.
Yeah.
Like I see some students are not good students. There are some students who are not good students, but I could tell they are very bright.
But they have sharp minds.
And they have sharp minds, and they're just not applying it. Some students are very intelligent, but they're just lazy. Then there are some students who are not the brightest, but they are hardworking, and they're learning, and they're willing to do extra work to catch up. I kind of wonder if, and I kind of like how you said school may not be for everyone. And to me, I think that has no reflection on the student's intelligence. It just means that maybe they can't succeed through the system that we have academically. That doesn't mean they can't be successful elsewhere, right? But we have a lot of students who feel like they have to go to college because, in a sense, it's almost like the only opportunity or the only way they can be a professional in whatever they want to do is if they have that fancy paper that said they finished the program.
Yeah, like back in like the baby boomer days, the ticket to success in the U.S. was a high school diploma, and then it became a college diploma, and now it seems to
higher education, masters.
to be able to flip a hamburger, you need a graduate degree. And I think though that, for instance, Michael Dell, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and countless others. Now they like to tell people they were college dropouts, but one thing, of course, is that their socioeconomic background was such that they weren't going to be eating hot dogs off of paper plates the next day, But be that aside, the fact remains is that a significant number of your titans of industry, entrepreneurs, do have a history of not completing college, but capitalizing. Like Michael Dell started out selling computers out of his dorm room, and now he's worth $100 billion. So he's not eating, hot dogs every night, and the same thing with Bill Gates. And I know some of them either went back to school, like Michael Jordan, one of the most successful people or athletes in the world. I believe he went back and finished his degree at UNC. And then sometimes others, they get honorary degrees.
But there's a flip side to that too, right? Because there's a lot of entrepreneurs that either didn't go to college, but they fail at their entrepreneurial journey as well. Then there are a lot of people who go to school for business and stuff, and they go out there and they try to start their business or whatnot, and they fail. And then there are a lot of people, like you mentioned, who didn't go to college or they dropped out and they became very successful. But I think majority of entrepreneurs don't succeed. And I think the big, like you said, titans of industries, I think those are like the 0.0001% of the population that tend to be very, very successful.
Yeah, and they tend to be smart as well.
Yeah.
Like for instance, I'm a self-confessed Apple fanboy. And Steve Jobs, has this reputation of being a visionary and stuff like that. And I think he was a visionary, and he was very smart. But I believe one thing also that these visionaries or titans of industry have in common is they were capitalizers. Like for instance,
opportunists.
Exactly. Thomas Edison. And he was a thief and a cheat as well. But for instance, Bill Gates, and maybe it does take someone who's smart, but for instance, it doesn't take a genius to figure out, for instance, when, Bill Gates saw, for instance, an opening, for instance, in terms of Microsoft DOS operating system in the early days of IBM, or when Park HP, or was it Digital Computing, showed Steve Jobs a graphical user interface with a mouse. he basically stole the idea because he was like, they don't realize what they have. And then of course he went on to, to start, Apple Computer and stuff. So I think one trait of these, perceived smart people is that they capitalize on opportunity.
Yeah, because it's like they say, history is told by the victors, right?
Yeah.
So you can have a really smart guy who came up with this idea, and then you can have someone who probably didn't come up with the idea, but they're like, oh, I could take what you did and make a version of it,
right.
and I see the potential, and they go off with it. And then history remembers those guys. Yeah. But it's like, you don't remember this guy, who that guy kind of bounced the idea from.
Like people remember Thomas Edison as being a smart, visionary inventor. But what you're often not told about Thomas Edison is he literally drove Nikola Tesla out of business, ruined his reputation. When it came to the AC/DC electrical current debate, for instance, I think it was in New York City, he literally spread rumors about his competitor saying that one of them the current was dangerous and would basically blow up homes. So people, what is it? The AC is now the dominating.
I think AC is what people use.
So there's
Alternate
an example.
currents,
There's an example where, I loathe the man, Thomas Edison. Ironically, in grade school, I did a report on him extolling his virtues, but now I've come to loathe the man. But there's an example. Hatred aside, there's an example where, strangely enough, a lot of your visionaries, like for instance Thomas Edison, or more recently, Mark Zuckerberg, they're thought of as super smart individuals who've created or invented these things. On the contrary, Thomas Edison was a thief, cheat, and a steal. Mark Zuckerberg, his fortune, not many people remember this, but his fortune based upon Facebook, or excuse me, Meta. He initially started Facebook to basically thumb his nose at a girl who rejected him in college, and he started Facebook to basically say, look at these people, they like me, they're my friends, and you snubbed me. So he didn't start Facebook because he was some social engineering networking guru. He started it because he was wanting to basically thumb his nose at this girl who rejected him.
Yeah, and I remember watching the movie The Social Network.
Oh yeah.
And there were some Harvard guys that did the whole networking social platform, and I think they called it Harvard Connect. Don't quote me, but it was something like that.
Yeah, I think that was one of the original names.
Yeah, and then Zuckerberg was like, "Ooh, that's a great idea," and he just made it wide to the population.
And basically,
rather than
he
Harvard Connect.
He co-opted, whether he bought it or basically he co-opted the original algorithm, and
made it public for everyone, not just the collective Harvard alumni or
and then
students.
As y'all know, the Winklevoss twins were the people who sued Mark Zuckerberg for stealing their idea. Of course, his history tells us they were forced out of Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg basically gave them money to settle, and then the Winklevoss twins, Tyler and I forget the other person's name, they basically later turned that money and became crypto billionaires.
Yeah. And have you seen, and this kind of reminds me of the show Shark Tank. Have you seen that show?
Yeah, Shark Tank.
Yeah, there's a lot of entrepreneurs who, some of them have really, some of them are very successful, but if you look at their inventions, some of them are not all that impressive, but they make good money out of it.
Like for instance, Scrub Daddy.
Oh yeah.
Everyone knows Scrub Daddy. Now it's a whole family. They work, they're simple.
I mean, it does take some level of intelligence to come up with that.
That's one of the success stories. It's difficult to get into Walmart, period, much less, what Scrub Daddy did. And then, for instance, one of the biggest fishes that got away from Shark Tank was, of course, the guy who started Ring, and then sold it to Amazon for $2 or $3 billion. And now he's starting up some other company. But sometimes you wonder, like for instance, looking back, like for instance, IBM, way in the early days of Microsoft DOS, could have bought Microsoft. Of course, Blockbuster Video in the early days could have bought Netflix, because Netflix was looking for a platform, one, to expand its DVD online, and Blockbuster laughed in their face. And of course, we know what happened after that. Google originally wanted to sell its algorithm, I believe, to Yahoo for like less than $100 million. But now, of course, Google is one of the largest companies in the world. And now, even though we have hindsight to look at those, but
there's a pattern.
There's a pattern, though. There's a pattern, though, for instance, where companies that basically let things pass them, like RIM/BlackBerry. It was a time where BlackBerry was the undisputed smartphone king. And then, for instance, another thing, Microsoft, there's this famous video of Steve Ballmer being asked about the iPhone in 2007, 2008. And Steve Ballmer, who's worth over 100 billion, he laughed and said, laughed at the iPhone, saying, who's going to buy a $600 unsubsidized phone? Because it was unsubsidized back then. And of course, history tells us, of course, that Steve Ballmer was severely wrong. They tried to, it was successful for a few years, Windows Mobile, Windows CE, and Sony made their phones for a while, but of course, they failed quick. Right. But I think it happens frequently enough to where you look at the examples of companies who are either no longer in existence or who are shadows of themselves. And there are certain characteristics, like BlackBerry could still own the smartphone market, but they thought the future was still, because they did not want to lose their current business customers who are used to the hardware, the keyboard.
Right.
I had a Crackberry once,
Yeah.
But they didn't see that people would want context keyboards, not fixed keyboards.
Right. Yeah.
But granted, it doesn't happen every day. But the leaders who I often question their cognitive ability, it happens enough to where you see the same traits over and over again.
No, and I agree a lot, and I think a lot of that goes back to the opportunist creative mindset, and sometimes the fiscally conservative business mindset. It's like, we're doing well, our company and everything's doing fine, let's try to continue to build our brand using what is retaining our customers, using what our customers like. And people are like, sometimes the opportunists are more risky. They're like, that's great, it's safe, we're bringing in money, our customers are happy, I know you want to continue down this road, but the next big thing is coming, and we got to get away from what we're doing. We have to reshape, restructure our whole model. And a lot of times people are like, no, we don't want to do that. We want to stick with what we think is safe, what's going to continue to generate revenue. And then next thing you know, things go under, a competitor comes up, and we're like, man, we should have done that. That was the next big idea.
I mean, just look at IBM. I mean, they had the IBM PC Junior and all this stuff with Charlie Chaplin ads and whatnot. But the reason why they failed is because the business suits didn't think that people would want to use computers at home. Of course.
No, and I remember watching that documentary about Blockbuster. Have you seen that one?
I've watched a few.
Yeah, and they told me that one of the main reasons why Blockbuster went out of business, because Blockbuster, they didn't innovate to do what Netflix did, where people could watch movies through an app, right? So one of the things that, because they could have done that, and rather than see Netflix, we would see Blockbuster, a Blockbuster app. But one of the things that they mentioned, and if my memory is correct, in the documentary was that one of the main things that put them out was they had the no more late fees policy. And I remember the commercials. I was just a kid, but I remember the commercials, and they're like, no more late fees, no more late fees. And that is one of the things that brought them under, because they wanted to please and satisfy the customers, which isn't a bad thing when you're doing a business. You satisfy your customer, they keep coming back. But in this case, people took advantage of that. They're like, oh, I got a copy of this movie, there's no more late fees, so I can hang on to it as long as I want. Some people never brought it back, and if people don't bring it back, then you can't re-rent it for money, and you lose CDs, and then eventually things just start tanking.
You could see in the last couple of years of Blockbuster's existence, they were starting to get desperate. They had the no late fee. They had basically the monthly membership where you could rent X amount or unlimited videos. And again, there was a thing where, for instance, when Netflix first approached them, and they laughed at Netflix because, again, they didn't want to lose their existing customers.
Right, yeah, no, that's a good example. So I do want to tie this into AI in cognition and technology. So we're talking about human intelligence. What are your thoughts on AI and how human intelligence and artificial intelligence can coexist.
I think today's artificial intelligence is not artificial intelligence, nor is it intelligence. I think it's a set of rule-based algorithms that are processed on extremely fast computers, for instance, in milliseconds and stuff. And the reason why I say that is because if you look at all of the applications of AI today, is they're domain specific. Like for instance, in the late 80s, where then FIDE world chess champion Garry Kasparov accepted a challenge by IBM's Deep Blue computer, and that IBM computer became the first computer in the world to defeat a world chess champion. It was hailed as an example of the future potential of AI. On the contrary, the IBM computer was programmed specifically to beat Garry Kasparov.
Oh, his style of chess play.
If you read Garry Kasparov's book, Deep Thinking, you will learn how IBM basically cheated in the process, in the challenge, and kept on moving the field goal, so to speak. And you look at, for instance, another famous instance in the documentary by Google called AlphaGo, in which Google sponsored a computer team to defeat then world champion Lee Sedol, with the world champion in Baduk, or the game Go. And again, that was an example where it was specifically programmed to beat him. Hardly an example of intelligence. Another reason that...
But wouldn't you say people do that too? Like if you look at sports, they study the players and they study the team, and then coaches adjust their team and say, when we play them, we're going to execute.
Do that naturally. And I would argue computationally faster. Now granted, humans will probably never be able to outperform the literal mechanical computations of a computer. We just can't think that fast. Right. But the end results, or the ability to think, we have not been surpassed yet. And I don't think we ever will, because there's this guy, Ray Kurzweil. He became famous for writing his book, The Singularity, in which he says that there will become a time of singularity where humans will basically kind of ascend, and that computers and AI will basically become basically AGI, general intelligence, and be able to surpass humans. The only problem with that is, for instance, the stereotypical example that people or futurists will give is that, with artificial intelligence, we'll have computers running robots, and then robots creating robots. But if you think about it logically and domain specifically, something inferior cannot create a superior being. That's just logically impossible. Secondly,
I mean, what would you say about people who created like computers that can do things?
It was still programmed by a human. Like, I have yet to see a computer program another computer. Secondly, most AI today, I actually do see promise in AI, but separately, most AI today, whether it be generative AI / ChatGPT, or some AI program that helps with cybersecurity or something, most AI algorithms under development today are either deductive or inductive. There is no major AI research done that matches more human intuition in abductive reasoning. For instance, an example of abductive reasoning is you go to your doctor and he tries to get a differential diagnosis on what's wrong with you. The problem with the others, inductive and deductive, is they either start with a conclusion and work down, or they work up to a perhaps preconceived conclusion. So all of the applications out there, good, some of them really good, is that they try to model, for instance, the intuition that Dr. Alan Turing wrote about in the 50s, by the father of artificial intelligence computing. And he the great mathematical mind he had a problem with intuition. because he thought everything could be reduced to some mathematical computation. And again, most applications of artificial intelligence today are domain specific. Like for instance, the IBM Deep Blue that computer could probably not tell you how to cook a boiled egg. They're all domain specific. And I think they'll remain domain specific because the hype that's been foisted upon us is, AGI, generalized intelligence, will, it's inevitable, and you're a fool if you don't recognize it. But I think that's not the case because one, you actually resign the scientific process to an inevitable conclusion, which the scientific process, as I understand it, conclusions are far from assumed or inevitable. And again, I think that artificial intelligence would not be artificial intelligence if it were not for the huge, vast, computationally fast server farms, because they need that. Right. Whereas humans, now it may take us a little more time, but we have the innate ability, whereas I see artificial intelligence as just rule-based algorithms based on sped up by the CPUs, GPUs, and the server farms. And one example of that is, for instance, in quantum computing and artificial intelligence, they in part use decision trees. And decision trees can be linear, meaning yes, no, or in the case of quantum computing, decision trees, one model that's being favored currently is the random rainforest decision tree, where, for instance, you have these trees, but instead of being straight yes, no, linear, the reason why random rainforest trees in quantum computing are pretty accurate and undergoing high levels of research is because they achieve a consensus not by wasting linear time, but they achieve consensus or computational result by randomly polling the trees in the rainforest, so to speak. And that's how they get their computation. Just like quantum computing, quantum mechanics by nature is not a degree of certitude, but it can achieve certitude likeness by the fact that it has multiple computations. Kind of like
would that be kind of like multiple neurons firing in the brain?
Yeah. Like for instance, in the neural network, quantum computing is, or artificial intelligence, like LLM transformer models that operate all of these apps like ChatGPT, Claude. They operate on transformer models, and they reflect kind of like a layered slice of neurons. And each time, like for instance, in real life, we get signals, we process things because of the firings of neurons. So the firings of neurons act like the weights and measures in the layered neural network of a computer. And based upon the weights and measures into mathematical formulas, that's how these transformer models process tokens that generate the text you see on the screen.
And isn't a big part of AI self-learning machine though?
Yeah, these
the more
machines,
data they put in, they kind of maintain that data, just like how people, the more they experience and learn, they retain as much of that information as they can, and then they can produce more output information.
They say it's learning, but I think in order to learn, you need to reason and to have intuition. Whereas, again, computationally on these huge server farms, they seem to learn only because they have mined so much data. Like for instance, prior to like a year or two ago, in generative AI, there's a thing known as a hallucination. And that's basically data that has been inadvertently or intentionally faked. So for instance, if you asked ChatGPT, again, I personally don't use it, I use Claude, but if you use ChatGPT, if you were to ask ChatGPT like 2 years ago, what is the world record for crossing the English Channel on foot? It would tell you, John Appleberry crossed the English Channel in, 8 hours and 12 minutes. And that's an actual real world example. But if you were to ask it today, it would say that there is no world record for crossing the English Channel because you would be walking on water. So it's not that it goes, oops, I made a mistake and I learned. It's just that the data it pulls is how it generates what it spits out on the screen. It's not necessarily, I don't think it's necessarily learning new information. It's just that it's able to pull more data.
That makes sense. Yeah. It's making inferences based off the information it receives.
Yeah.
And if it receives, if it doesn't receive information, then it's almost like it can't learn.
Like for instance,
it can't evolve.
I'll give you an example where, for instance, most of these transformer models that run behind ChatGPT, Claude, Google's Gemini, have what are known as knowledge cutoffs. So for instance, the knowledge cutoff may be 2024, like November. So if you ask it, for instance, something that happened late 2025, it won't know, and it'll tell you. But if you ask it again, let's say sometime after that, it may be able to tell you, not because it learned it, but because each prompt that you type in and it pulls, it gets more data. So now it knows, despite the knowledge cutoff, it knows that, let's say the Dodgers won the World Series or something like that. Yeah.
Nice. Well, you are a very smart man. And some of that stuff I wasn't able to follow, and I'm surprised I did. But I really enjoyed our conversation. I hope you did too. I do have some closing questions I want to ask you. I want to ask you, what would you like our audience to know about your passion, or in this case, artificial intelligence or high-functioning individuals? What information would you like to make them aware of, or just to share with them?
Despite, my interest in, for instance, cognitive ability or the hereditability of cognitive ability, the so-called bell curve, is individuals shouldn't allow themselves to be trapped by a label. I mean, I, for one, I don't mind labels, but don't let yourself be limited by that label. Like, for instance, you may be, let's say, have a lower cognitive score than someone else, but you may end up more successful because of, for example, your motivation or something. Similarly, ironically, when I was adopted, my parents had me assessed, and for years they didn't tell me what my score was because they didn't want me to be lazy.
That's smart. I like that.
I mean, I did later find out, and that score was lower than my current score, because even I would agree that certain types of intelligence are fluid, and then there are of course some static types.
Right.
But knowing my Z-score, as I like to call it, is, on the contrary, it hasn't made me less willing to do something or lazy. On the contrary, it's made me more motivated, because being able to learn X, Y, Z, like for instance, being a technology professor, I feel compelled to share with others, because particularly in the technology field, even here, for instance, in a collegiate setting, is the world is increasingly being divided by tech haves and tech nots. So the technically literate will automatically be filtered, perhaps socioeconomically, toward at least the path of success. Similarly, for instance, someone who might have a higher Z-score than someone else might, on the surface, be similarly situated toward a path of success. But I liken it to an example where, for instance, if someone hands you a check, you still have to cash it. And I would just say to anyone, whether in an academic setting or, for instance, just someone who's looking to be cognitively assessed, is don't be limited by a label. And I would argue, basically, the more you have, the more I think you're obligated to help others.
It's very nice. So on that note, I have one last question to ask you. So you're obviously very passionate about entertaining your mind to learn more and pursue more, and that's a very passionate, a good passionate habit to have. What advice would you give others to help them discover what they are passionate about, whether it's music or art or sports or academia or reading?
If you find yourself drawn to something, I don't know, like optical quantum lattices. Pursue that until you kind of, the person will know if that's for them or not for them. So pursue it, capitalize on opportunities. Like for instance, even like, let's say, as a student, or like as a professor or as a general adult, is pursue opportunities to where you can be exposed or absorb more knowledge, and then also pursue opportunities to where, for instance, you might be able to share knowledge. I would argue that one of the, maybe not necessarily types, but one of the facets of cognitive ability is basically getting water out of the soaked sponge.
Squeezing as much as you can out of it. All right. Well, on that note, I think it was a wonderful interview. We have a lot of wonderful contents, and you added so much to, that made my mind curious about so many more things. But anyways, last question. Did you enjoy the interview and did you have fun?
Yes.
Yeah. Perfect.
Yes, I like to, anytime I talk about something that expands the mind, I enjoy.
Yeah. Good. Well, I enjoyed it too. Yeah. Thanks a lot. It was great.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed that interview, please click like, share, and subscribe to support my content. If you have any questions for our guest, please leave them in the comments section or message me on Instagram for a response video and a special shout out to you. Until next time, I'm your host, Rocky Lowe, saying, learn with purpose and live with passion. Stay rational, folks.